This section is going to be dedicated to talking about water quality and pollution. We've talked about how essential water is for a wide variety of human activities in different sectors and how freshwater sources get used up. We've also talked about water scarcity and how there's such a thing as economic scarcity where enough water exists in a region to meet people's needs, but the water infrastructure, including water treatment plants, is lacking. In fact, a significant percentage of the world population lacks access to basic clean drinking water. In much of Asia, between 1 and 24% of people do not have access to clean drinking water, and in many parts of Africa, 25 to 50%, and even over 50% of people don't have clean drinking water available to them. Unsafe water is a huge public health issue in many parts of the world. And it actually kills more people than natural disasters and conflicts combined. In the year 2020, 485,000 people were killed by unsafe water, and the WHO estimates that unsafe drinking water is responsible for about 80% of diseases in developing countries. That's a huge number. So, what makes water unsafe to drink? In this section, we're going to talk about different sources of pollution that affect water quality. Water quality is defined as the physical, chemical, and biological properties of water that impact its intended use. So, contaminants of any of these three types, physical, chemical, or biological, can degrade water quality. We'll talk about each of them, but first, one distinction to make is between different water sources of pollution. In this section, we're going to be focusing largely on surface water pollution. And in the next section, we will look at groundwater pollution. So keep that in mind. Point source pollution is a word used to describe water pollution coming from a single point. So, for example, a sewage pipe that is emptying into a river would be a type of point source solution. Non-point source pollution is pollution that originates from a large dispersed area of land rather than a single point. So, for example, fertilizer runoff from a large tract of cropland or heavy metals that run off from city streets after it rains are examples of non point source pollution. We also divide surface water pollution up into three different types depending on the nature of the contaminant. Chemical pollution is, of course, pollution that is derived from chemicals, including toxic heavy metals like lead and cadmium, fertilizers from agriculture, organic pollutants like those POPs that we talked about previously, acid mine drainage, pharmaceuticals that get into the water supply when they're discharged from our bodies into the sewage system, materials from wastewater treatment plants, and radioactive waste. Physical pollutants include sediment pollution, which is the buildup of minerals, those sand, silt, and clay particles we talked about previously, building up in waterways, trash that is thrown into bodies of water, and thermal pollution, which is a bit of a different concept, but the idea is that heat acts as a physical pollutant because raising the temperature of water harms the aquatic organisms that live in that water. Then, thirdly, biological pollutants refer to infectious microscopic organisms in the water. These include bacteria, viruses, parasitic protozoa, and parasitic worms. These pathogens are usually included in water, introduced into water through sewage contamination or contamination from the fecal matter of livestock operations. So, we're going to walk through these categories. Let's first begin with chemical pollution. The majority of inorganic chemical pollutants are non point source pollutants. These include heavy metal contaminants from urban areas, which generate a lot of pollution from vehicle exhaust, for example, as well as heavy metals in mine tellings. These also include nitrogen and phosphate fertilizers that run off from cropland, which is an issue that we've talked about previously and we're going to come back to in a moment. But not all pollutants are non-point sources. Some are point source, including chlorine that gets used in water treatment facilities to kill pathogenic microorganisms that contaminate water. As well as heavy metals that are in the waste. released from industrial manufacturing plants. But let's revisit the fertilizer pollutants because these are a big source of marine ecosystem collapse, and they have become more problematic in coastal areas around the US and around the world in recent years. The process that this fertilizer runoff initiates in marine ecosystems, as we've mentioned before, is called eutrophication. The way eutrophication works is that excess fertilizer that's applied to cropland runs off into surface water sources, which carry the fertilizer to the ocean. There, the fertilizer fuels an algal bloom, which is an explosion in the growth of algae and cyanobacteria that thrive on nitrogen and phosphorus. And by the way, this doesn't have to happen just in an ocean, it can occur in a lake as well. And these blooms become so dense that they block sunlight from penetrating the water and reaching aquatic plants like seaweed that rely on it, which kills them. And then when those algae die, they get consumed and by decomposers in the ocean who use cellular respiration to break down their organic molecules for energy and consume oxygen in the process, which depletes oxygen from the water and suffocates the marine animals, causing what are called fish kills, which is a mass death of fish from suffocation after an algal bloom. As if that wasn't enough, some of these types of algae that are involved in the bloom produce toxic compounds called cyanotoxins. These types of algae are technically cyanobacteria, but they're called sometimes blue-green algae. And that's where the name cyanotoxins comes from. And they directly kill aquatic animals and can also accumulate in shellfish and cause food poisoning in humans when those shellfish are harvested and consumed. All in all, the death of the marine plants and animals after eutrophication leads to what are called dead zones in the ocean. There is a well known dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that occurs seasonally at the point where the Mississippi River Delta drains into the ocean. As you can see from this image, the watershed area of the Mississippi River is huge, and so the river ends up accumulating large amounts of fertilizer runoff from Midwestern agriculture. And then it all drains into the Gulf of Mexico at a consolidated point every year. The dead zone occurs seasonally in line with crop planting patterns, and so the size of the dead zone changes every year, but even in the smallest years, it is about the size of the state of Delaware. As we said, eutrophication events have been increasing in coastal areas around the US and around the world, but there are several approaches that can reduce them. One of them is reducing the amount of fertilizer used, as well as applying fertilizer to cropland in a more efficient, precise manner to maximize the potential of it being absorbed by crops. Another approach is protecting watersheds, which are areas of land that drain into rivers and lakes by maintaining vegetation cover that can interrupt runoff into waterways. And finally, upgrading wastewater treatment plants to include technologies that remove fertilizers from water before it is discharged back into the environment. That wraps things up for chemical pollution. Now let's talk about physical pollution. Physical pollution comes in many forms, but the most significant one is excess sediment that runs off from erosion of cropland, forested areas that have been clear cut, and other poorly managed lands. These mineral sediments can change the path of water in rivers and streams. They fill up storm drains and canals and cause water to become murky, which blocks sunlight and inhibits the growth of aquatic plants, which has consequences up the food chain. Other sources of physical pollution include plastic products that end up in surface water. This photo you can see is of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, a collection of floating plastic trash in the Pacific Ocean that covers 1.6 million square kilometers. Because plastic degrades so slowly, research on the patch has shown that a portion of the items are over 50 years old. Other sources of physical pollution are timber debris, and cardboard products, and thermal pollution. Thermal pollution is different from these other types. It's included here because heat and temperature are a physical phenomenon. Thermal pollution is caused by the return flow of water that is hotter than the source of the water. So, for example, when a power plant withdraws water from a river to use in a cooling capacity, and then it returns that water back to the river, the water re enters at a hotter temperature compared to when it was withdrawn, which raises the temperature of the river as a whole. This thermal pollution can cause several consequences. One of them is lower levels of oxygen dissolved in the water. As a general rule, the warmer the water, the less gas remains dissolved in it, and this includes oxygen. As a result, with less oxygen available, the population of aquatic animals like fish can decline, and this can have extended consequences for the ecosystem. The last category of pollutants we will talk about before closing on this section is biological pollution. Biological pollution refers to contaminants that are alive: bacteria, viruses, parasitic protozoa, and parasitic worms. The most common waterborne bacterial pathogens include Escherichia coli, more commonly known as E. coli. E. coli is actually a harmless member of our gut microbiome, but certain strains can cause gastroenteritis. Shigella dysentery causes the severe diarrheal illness known as dysentery. Vibrio cholera causes another severe diarrheal illness called cholera. And a specific serovar of salmonella called Salmonella enterica serovar typhi causes an infection called typhoid fever. Mostly these bacteria are transmitted from water being contaminated with fecal matter of an infected person or animal. The most common waterborne viral contaminants are rotavirus and norovirus. These are very common. There are about 20 million cases of norovirus in the US alone every year, and 3 million cases of rotavirus. Rotavirus used to be much more common, but infants are given a vaccine for it now. And infections with these viruses and the above bacteria tend to have a very low mortality rate in developed industrialized countries. Almost no one dies from them. However, they do have a high mortality rate in developing countries because their disease mechanism induces such severe diarrhea that it leads to life threatening dehydration, especially in infants and children. That in countries with weak medical infrastructure where IV fluids are not readily available, these infections can be quite deadly. Some common waterborne parasitic protozoa are Giardia lamblia, which causes an infection simply known as Giardia. One moment here. Okay. Uh, this is the most common parasitic infection in the US. Entamoeba histolytica is another, which causes amoebic dysentery. And then there's an extensive list of parasitic worms that are transmitted through contaminated water. Some of the more major ones are schistosomiasis, which you can acquire just through skin contact with contaminated water, liver flukes, and guinea worm. Although there have been great strides made in preventing guinea worm infections in recent decades, and the number of infections has dropped off steeply. Final note before we move from this section, we've been talking about water pollution as it occurs in surface water like lakes, rivers, and oceans, but groundwater pollution is also a problem. Groundwater can accrue contamination from both natural sources and human sources. A natural source of metal contamination in water is the erosion of rocks and minerals which come into contact with the water in the underground environment. And of course, pollution discharges from human activities can infiltrate the ground and seep their way into aquifers. This includes the usual range of suspects we've mentioned before: agricultural runoff, runoff from urban environments, etc. And these human activities can also include leaking septic tanks. Septic tanks, in case you don't know, are an underground tank that is used to hold sewage for homes that aren't connected to a municipal sewage system. They're more common in rural areas, but if those septic tanks leak, then it can introduce fecal pathogens into the groundwater, which can then contaminate it with infectious microorganisms for people who are drawing up that same groundwater in their wells.